all about making copies of objects in PowerShell, and just that it's a little bit more difficult than you might think. I won't reintroduce myself. I got my bio slide here for posterity, but let me cover the agenda and learning objectives. This is a quick talk, by the way. I think we'll be done in about 15 minutes, maybe less. I'm going to cover just at a high level what objects are in PowerShell. A lot of you probably already know this, but I'll just cover it just for completion. And then I want to show you what happens when you try to make a copy of one. It might be a little bit surprising because it's not immediately intuitive to people that come from a scripting background as opposed to like a traditional programming background. And then I'm going to share some code, or at least demonstrate some quick code, and then share it on GitHub later that I use to make a copy of an object. So, you know, this is a little bit low level, but I want you to kind of understand how PowerShell treats the equal sign assignment operator with objects, because it's not what you might expect, and some of the low level reasons for the behavior, and then also code considerations for working around the problem. And what I'll just kind of say here, the reason this talk might be interesting is because some of you may be aware of ways to do this. However, I'll promise you that they're most likely not going to be backward compatible ways. I've got code that is backward compatible. So if you're ever in that use case or you just want to make sure your code is as robust as possible, I've got, what I think is pretty good code for doing this. And I will say that some of the information on like Stack Exchange, for example, is wrong in terms of the best ways to do this, or it's maybe just outdated. Well, it might have been true at one point, but no longer is true. So, so glad you're here. I think this is something interesting for anybody who needs to do this. So what do I mean by objects? I had to put a meme here, and this is a kind of a nerdy CS joke for anybody who has that kind of a background. But really, when the first thing when you talk about objects are classes, right? You got to understand what a class is, and that's really, I'm being simplistic here, but it's really a data model plus a list of things you can do with it. That's the simplest way I can explain what a class is. And an object is an instance of that class. So I stole this this graphic off TechTarget. Thank you, TechTarget. But an example of a class would be a human, like a human, right? It has many attributes about them. And an instance of that human class would be an individual person, right? That has a name, for example. That human has many data points about them: their height, their weight, their age, you know, other things like that, hair color. So those are all properties, right? Or data points. Humans also have methods, like things they can do: breathe, yell, conduct a PowerShell event, you know, all those things, right? Those are methods, right? So that's my example. I promise you, though, that this will be the only time you'll ever hear me objectify someone. That was a joke we made earlier on our dry run, so I hope it's still funny. So let me quickly demo this. 1 second, let me just flip over to PowerShell. Okay, so I'm going to get object information in PowerShell. For those that don't know how to do that, I'm going to show that really quickly. That's kind of a beginner thing. And then I'm going to create a simple custom object. So, second, scroll bars. All right. Oh yeah, and I forgot to connect to Exchange Online. So let me do that real quick. Sorry, guys and gals. I'm going to need this in a moment. This is not the topic, but I'm going to show you a. Oops, sorry, I meant to do this in. I don't have that module installed. My bad. And if this works consistently, my man Aiden Greenwald is about to get a shout out. So. One second, MFA. All right. This controls, oh yeah, look at that, control mouse wheel. I learned something today, nice. All right, so I'll need that later. I'm not gonna use that right now. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna use that right now. So let's get some information about an object. I'm gonna do that in old school PowerShell 5.1. So I'm gonna get one Exchange recipient from my Exchange organization in Office 365. And I'm gonna display the information about that recipient. And like I said, my man Aiden Greenwald gets a shout out here. He's a guest in my tenant, apparently. I don't remember granting him guest access, and I question what he has access to, but there he is. But okay, so I got a recipient. I just showed the name and recipient type, great. But like, let's say I want to do something with that object and I want to know what there is to do with it. Well, I can pipe that object to get member. And this gives me a ton of properties, and in this case, only a few methods. But this is how you find out like what you can do with a particular object, right? Whether it's data or methods. So that's just some general PowerShell knowledge there for those that didn't already know that. But let's go ahead and create a custom object that's similar to the example I gave earlier. There we go. So again, this is backward compatible syntax. There are other ways to do this. Don't judge me too hard. But I created a new PS custom object and I added 3 properties to it. So I added a legal name, which is my name. I added an email address and I added a Twitter handle. And that's all my contact information. So I can display that object just like you would expect. And there it is, right? It only has 3 properties. So luckily we're able to see them all and none of them are too long where they're getting truncated. But if I wanted to use the same method or same approach I took earlier, I can display things with get member as well. And there's the full output. Now, let me go back to the slides here. So I just want to quickly talk about the assignment operator. So if I have code like this, you can probably read this and kind of, even if you're not real familiar with PowerShell, you can probably read this code and figure out what's going on. So if I take my tenure at West Monroe, which is about 15 years, and store that in a variable, and then I take my colleague, Andrew Top, and I create a variable for him, and I say, Andrew's been at West Monroe about the same time as me, so I just use the equal sign assignment operator there. And so I say Andrew's time at West Monroe is about Frank's time. And then if I think about my colleague Bob's time at West Monroe, I say, well, yeah, Bob's been there about as long as Andrew, and so I set that equal as well. But then I'm like, wait, no, actually Bob started before Andrew, about a year before Andrew, so let me just add 1 to Bob's tenure. Right? That's going to do what you expect it to do. And if I show the output in this sample PowerShell window, Frank's time at West Monroe is 15, just like you would expect. Andrew's time is 15, and Bob's time is 16. So that worked exactly like you would expect, right? Nothing earth-shattering there. Things get a little bit more interesting when you try and copy a custom object, however. So let me do that. Oh, 1 second. Back to PowerShell. So if I just do this with the equal sign operator, I'm going to make a copy of my contact object, and let's just say I want to create one for Ryan, who you heard speak earlier. So I did that, and let's show the copy. Right. Okay. So I just made a copy, so it still has Frank's contact information. Not surprising. And let's make sure Frank is still there. Of course he is. There he is. All right, so now we've got our object, right? It's got the same properties as Frank's, which is great. That's what I was going for. I want consistently. But let's update them to match Ryan's contact information. So there we go. I just did that, right? And that worked. I didn't get any errors. And of course, I can display the object, and it has Ryan's contact information. Okay, that makes sense, and it's pretty straightforward. Things get a little more interesting when I try and display Frank's contact information. All of a sudden, Frank became Ryan. What? That's kind of, the first time I saw this, I was a little confused.
I'm sorry, Frank, that would be confusing to be me.
Yeah, well, that's all right. So yeah, a little strange, but that's kind of demonstrates the problem, I would say. Or maybe that's not a problem, it's just an interesting behavior that you need to be aware of. So the key point here is for more complex objects, the assignment operator does not make a copy like you think it might. It creates a pointer to the original object. Yeah, and Todd's pointing out a shallow copy. Exactly. That's what it's using. Although you're getting in the .NET territory that's a little bit beyond my knowledge. And to me, it's like the thing I'll kind of mention is that PowerShell handles this automatically in most cases. So, when you're working with a complex object and you pass that object as a parameter or something, it automatically passes a reference. At least it seems to me that it's automatically like referencing that object and passing it along in the background without you needing to then dereference it. And if I'm speaking a foreign language to folks that don't have a CS background, don't worry. The key point is that it's pretty much automatic, which is good. But the thing I want to call out is, the main difference here, where I was coming from is, I'm more anchored in scripting, and scripting languages don't generally behave this way. They behave more like what's called a deep copy, which Todd just mentioned, meaning it makes a clone of the object when you use the equal sign operator. That is what I expected to happen in PowerShell, given that it's a scripting language, but it's not what happens. And that's because PowerShell is based on .NET, which is more traditionally a compiled language. And Aiden, if you're still on the line, I put this Bob Ross meme in here for you. So I hope you enjoy it. So how do we fix this? How do we do a deep copy? In other words, Todd, to your question. We can use some .NET objects, which is cool, right? So for serializable objects, you can just serialize the object and then deserialize it, right? That's great. Except you're probably reading that and saying like, who shot who in the what now? That's how I felt when I read this for the first time. So I don't expect you to fully understand that unless you're coming from a .NET or development background. But that's basically how you do this: is you serialize the object, then you deserialize it. That's great for serializable objects, but there are also what's called non-serializable objects, and that's where things get a little more interesting, and certainly more confusing. So here's where, depending on the version of PowerShell you're running, you need to determine if the PS serializer object is available, and if it is, then you can use it to serialize a non-serializable object. That's great, right? That's cool. Makes things easier. But if that object is not available, either because there's something wrong with .NET, and yes, I have seen that, or because you're on an older version of PowerShell or an older version of Windows, perhaps, that doesn't have PS serializer available, then your options are using the export CLI XML robust and import commandlet. And this is pretty cringeworthy, but what it's doing is it's taking the object, creating an XML representation of it, and writing it to disk. Yes, disk, not memory, a file on your disk. So your approach here would be export it, import it, remove the file. So it works, but it's not exactly efficient. The other thing I want to mention is that this gets complicated because both approaches for non-serializable objects are subject to a copy depth. So again, I'm getting a little bit over my skis here in terms of deep .NET knowledge, but my understanding of why this is relevant is you can have objects that reference other objects, and you can kind of have a circular dependency is one example, and there may be other reasons that this is a problem. But as you are creating this, effectively this XML representation of these objects, and they're nested objects, you could see how that nesting would, go infinitely if there's like that circular relationship defined. So there has to be a copy depth limit. And there's also upper limits on how much memory and or disk space there are in your system. So you need to be careful about this a little bit, and just know that this can be unreliable in some cases. And I also want to mention that both of these approaches are slow. Memory is not terribly slow, but it's significantly slower than copying a serializable object. And disk is god-awful slow compared to either using memory or doing this deep copy on a serializable object. So this is a wall of text, and I just gave you a ton of information that's probably a little bit hard to follow. So I just want to kind of call out that you can either memorize this because you have a photographic memory, or you can just use my code. I recommend the latter. So did I skip my demo? I didn't have a demo placeholder. So let me do my demo before I go to the recap. Sorry about that. So to do this, let me pull up PowerShell. There it is. And let me flip to my demo script. Where did you go? There it is. All right. So I'm going to load up the copy object function, and I'm going to sloppily copy and paste this in my PowerShell prompt, even though I could .source it or something. So bear with me there. This is a lot of code. It's like almost 2,000 lines of code. Yes, 2,000 lines. And that's because I've got some error handling and a whole bunch of backward compatible nonsense in here that just blows the code up, unfortunately. Okay, I'm just making sure I have everything highlighted, and I do. So let me paste that in. Do I? Yeah, I do. Okay. I'm going to do this in PowerShell 7 also, which might, yeah, that's PowerShell version 5.1 does this like jerky thing. I don't know how to describe it. You see it on my screen though. It's doing that where it does like one line at a time, and like It's weird. It's like a weird bug. It will eventually work, but let me just minimize that. And I'm going to use PowerShell 7 for this. But I promise the code does work, and it would just be more efficient if I dot source it. Where'd my window go? There it is. Okay. Okay, we're pasting in. This does not do that. Oh, shit. Sorry. I'm connected to my Raspberry Pi. Darn it. All right. Fail. Sorry. Okay. PowerShell 7 on my computer. Let's go. There we go. So this will take a minute to paste in. It does usually speed up. So what I'm going to do is recreate the Frank contact object, and then I'm going to use my, I guess I can show you the function header while that's pasting. So I've just got a simple function called copy-object. And I guess the best way to explain that is just show the examples here. So you can create a source object, and I've got an example here that I believe is not a serializable object, so it's actually a good example, and it also is present, I think, on any system, upward inflection, question mark. Pretty sure that any system that has .NET Framework or .NET Core would have this object. So this code, I think, works pretty well in many places. You need to have a destination object, and in this case, it can just be null. It doesn't need to be initialized at all. Well, sorry, it needs to be a valid variable on the system, but it doesn't need to have a value stored. It can be stored as null. And then the code that you would run looks like this. So you need to have a return code. Return code tells you if the operation completed successfully. I don't use write error or anything like that because I don't think it's a very graceful way to capture and react to errors. So you'll need to check int return code, and we're looking for that to be, as you see up here, 0, indicating success. If the source object was serializable and it was successful, this would return 0, which is great. That's the best condition. You can also get a 1, which is a success code, but it's like almost like a warning because the source object was not serializable. And in that case, there's this copy depth limitation. So the new object, the Ryan Kellerman object, may not be an exact clone of the original object, the Frank object. And then 2 would indicate a straight up failure. So something went wrong in the process. Let's see if that's done. Yes, it is. Okay, great. So I'm going to move my cheat sheet off over here, and 1 second. Let me just get the code to paste it in. So here is that Frank Lesniak object recreated, and I'm going to 1 sec. Screw something up here? It did, yeah, okay. So we're gonna set Ryan as null.
Ouch.
Sorry, Ryan. Just being efficient in memory usage, you know? And now I'm gonna run my copy command. So this is doing a deep copy, not a shallow copy. And so if I was doing this, the first thing I would do is check, return code, and I got a 1, right? So 1, remember, tells you that it was successful, but my source object was not serializable. So therefore, the Ryan object may not be an exact copy of the original. So it's just something to know. It's still successful, but you might need to react differently next if your result is a 1. For example, I didn't go through this in the function header, but you can increase the copy depth if you wanted to improve your assurance. So anyway, so let's make some changes to the copy, and I'm going to replay those same Ryan Kellerman contact info changes. And now let's see them. And I'm going to just, for time's sake, display Ryan and Frank. So lo and behold, Ryan has his updated information, and so does Frank. So it worked. You might be wondering, though, like, how do you check to see if something is serializable? And it's actually pretty simple. All you do is you do a .getType, which is a method on any object. It should be available on any PowerShell object. And then the getType has a property called isSerializable. And so this would tell me that my source object, the custom Frank contact information object, is not serializable. So, I don't know if that really matters, but it's just a programmatic way to make that determination before you call copy object, should you want to do that. So that is the end of my demo. Hopefully that made sense. I'm kind of glossing over a lot of the nerdery in the code, but you can look at that on GitHub later and hit me up if you have any questions. So just as a recap, I covered objects in PowerShell and what happens if you try and copy them. And you saw that it does a shallow copy or basically creates a pointer when you do that, which depending on where you're coming from, whether that's like traditional programming background or maybe a scripting background like me, that may not be what you expected. And I gave you some alternative code, or at least showed some alternative code to perform a copy. And again, I will post it on GitHub. So hopefully I've achieved the learning objectives here of kind of covering why the equal sign operator does what it does and some of the low level reasons for that. And also like what's happening in the code that I wrote to work around the problem. So with that, I mean, for anybody whose eyes haven't maybe glazed over, because this is pretty low level, I'll pause and see if there's any questions. But before Amanda tees me up with a question, I'll just mention that for anybody who's sticking around after we get through questions, I'm going to show everybody's contact information one last time in case you missed that. And I realized that I put Danny's Twitter handle incorrect. So sorry about that, Danny. I'll show that in a second, but just a call out there. And then we're going to stop recording after we show everybody's contact information one last time. And then we'll see how this goes. Hopefully there's no more trolls in the Zoom meeting, but we'll transition to a virtual happy hour for anybody who wants to stick around. And again, we'll just see how that goes. So with that, are there any questions?
I don't think I got any for this session.
Okay. Great. And Todd, just a shout out in the chat. I saw you posted some, and just because this is being recorded and for posterity, I'll bring the chat window over. Can you guys see that on my screen? Or is that hidden?
It's hidden.
Yeah, we don't see it.
Okay, Zoom is too clever. All right, sorry. But Todd shared a Python example of a shallow versus deep copy. So, as well as a deep explanation on why it's problematic to do object copying in C++, Java, and C#. So that's pretty cool.